Good morning, church. Welcome to Memorial Road. Today is an exciting day. We're starting a new series on the book of Esther. We're calling it Courage in Complexity. So, quick quiz on the book of Esther as we begin. Who is the bad guy in the book of Esther? Good, you can say it out loud. Okay, who is the king? Anybody know the king? It's King Xerxes. Who is Esther's cousin? Mordecai. Good character in the book. And I'll give you one slightly harder question. Esther has a second name. What is her other name in the book? Hadassah. Many of you know that one as well. It's a very familiar story. In fact, if you're reading through the Old Testament and you get all the way to Esther, it's a relief in some sense because it reads like a novel. In fact, it's one of the most interesting, exciting, invigorating parts of the entire Old Testament. There's really interesting characters, there's plot twists, there's a surprise at the end, there's a lot of irony in the story, so it just feels like you're reading a book. We're going to take a particular angle when we look at the story of Esther over the next few weeks, and the angle's on the screen. It's the title of the series, Courage in Complexity. That's definitely one of the big themes of this book. And it's very relevant today because life is complicated. You know this. All sorts of the parts of our lives are very complex. Information's complicated. When you go to find out about a news story and you read it on 3 different news sites, you're going to get 3 different angles on that story. It's impossible today to read information and to read news without a slant or an agenda. It's complicated. Artificial intelligence is making life very complex at the moment. AI can write essays, produce political ads, simulate your best friend emotionally. And so all sorts of questions are being asked about AI. How do we regulate it? Well, what is helpful? What is harmful in this arena? What do ethics look like when it comes to artificial intelligence? It's pretty complex. Work-life balance is complex. Most people that I know, they want a successful career. They want a really, really good, devoted, vibrant family. They want an immaculate home. They want an amazing body. They want a vibrant spiritual life. And they want to sleep 8 hours a night. That doesn't happen. Like for anybody, that doesn't happen. And the reason that doesn't happen is because life, say it with me, it's complicated. Our relationships are very complicated. My guess is you've got a friend right now or maybe a family member right now, and it's just kind of dicey. You're trying to build the bridge, you're trying to find the common ground, but you're just a little nervous around that person. Life is complicated. Culture is complicated. What's good? What's evil? What do we embrace? What do we resist? It's complicated. And so this book of Esther is actually really helpful because it's actually a fairly complex story. So if you've thought your whole life that this is just an adorable story about this sweet little girl that saves her people, that's not completely true. It's a lot deeper than that. In fact, for example, think about this. The hero of the story of Esther is this teenage girl who basically abandons her Jewish identity, sells herself out, puts her body on the line to take the throne. There's no VBS song exactly about that. That's an odd part of the story. The opening scene of the story is this weird depiction of these power-hungry men objectifying the queen. And she's disposed because of this, and yet that event leads to all the good things that eventually happen in the book. And so in a strange way, it almost seems like misogyny is part of the way God works his will out in this book. Well, that's weird. That's complex. And we're just scratching the surface here. There's violence, there's political subterfuge, there's seduction. It's a seedy book. There's not a lot of moral exemplars in the book. Mordecai would be the closest we get to that. And famously, God is not even mentioned in the book. It's complicated. And yet, the book of Esther, despite all of this, still is this amazing story about a God who has the ability to work in the middle of a mess. And so it's a story worth looking at. And so if it's been a while since you've read this story in your daily Bible reading, I'd like to summarize the first part of the book, and we're going to talk about one idea this week and then a different idea in the next 2 weeks. So this is an introductory message with one simple takeaway. So here's how the book begins. We're in the 5th century, city of Susa. King Xerxes is on the throne. Israel's in exile, wondering what this means about their identity as the people of God. And we have this strange scene where the queen, her name is Vashti or Vashti, and King Xerxes, he asked her to come parade before these men at the party, and she doesn't, and so she's fired. That's chapter 1. Chapter 2, this search is put on throughout the whole country to find a new queen. It's the Miss Persia pageant. And so all these teenagers come to the throne, come to the palace to parade before the king. And one strange part of the story that I still do not understand is all these young ladies come up to get ready. Do you remember how long it takes them to get ready to come before the king? Anybody remember? It takes a year. Now, I live with 3 women, and to this day, like when we're getting ready to go somewhere and when they go into the bathroom and they close the door to get ready, I don't know what women do in bathrooms to get ready. Like, this is one of the questions that I'm going to ask God when I get to heaven. Like, I don't know. I don't know what happens. And I don't know why it takes the length of time that it does. But I'm grateful that the women in my life look wonderful after they get ready. But that's just, a few minutes, and I gotta be careful what I say now. So that's just a few minutes of time. But in Esther, a year? It doesn't make any sense to me why this would take a year. In fact, in the text, it says for 6 months, they put on oil and myrrh, and then the second 6 months, it says they put on perfume and cosmetics. I don't even know what myrrh is, but apparently you need 180 days to apply it. So I'm not sure what's going on in this part of the story, but at the end of the day, by the end of chapter 2, Esther has won the beauty pageant, and she now is the queen. That's chapter 2. Chapter 3, we are introduced to a new character. His name's Haman. My guess is that you would not like Haman if you just were hanging out with the guy. I don't think I would like Haman if I was hanging out with the guy. If you were just to get to know him, eventually the subject of hobbies would come up. And he might ask you what your hobbies are, and you would say, well, I like to take walks in nature. I like to watch a good movie, things like that. And then if you turn the question back to him and you said, hey, Haman, what do you like to do? He would say, well, I like to ride my horse around the city while people bow down to me. That's the kind of guy that Haman is. And that's what he does in the book of Esther. He gets on a horse, he rides around the city, and people bow down to him. Apparently he's gone up really quickly in the ranks in royalty. And so one day he's out, and there's another new character in chapter 3, Mordecai. Well, Mordecai is not impressed with Haman. And so at this point, I'm going to read from the book of Esther, chapter 3, starting in verse 5. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet, having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai, and this next sentence is the most egregious overreaction in the Bible. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. So in Haman's mind, he's looking at Mordecai and he's saying, okay, you didn't bow down to me, so therefore I'd like to murder your entire people. Like, this is just, it's a strange guy. This is quite the curveball in the story. You've got this horse-prancing, maniacal Haman who wants to wipe out the entire Jewish people. So he goes to the king and he makes his pitch. He says there's a group of people and they're a little different than us. They don't follow all the rules, and I think we should wipe them out. And Xerxes says, okay, I agree with you. Let's proceed with your plan to eliminate the Jews. And just to give you a little context to understand King Xerxes better, back in chapter 1, when Queen Vashti wouldn't come out before the people at the party, King Xerxes was troubled about this decision as to whether or not he should fire her as queen. And so he consulted with people, asking his advisors what they thought he should do. That was chapter 1. In chapter 3, when Haman comes to the king with this idea of eliminating an entire group of people in the city, King Xerxes does not consult anybody. He just says, okay, sounds like a great idea, let's do this. In other words, King Xerxes spends more time thinking about a dispute in his marriage than the genocide of an entire group of people. King Xerxes is not all there. Like, this is a very, very erratic king. And so now, Esther, she has to make a decision. She has ascended to a very high position in the kingdom. She has some influence, but she has to decide whether or not she's going to use it. Now, to you and I, this seems like a no-brainer. We want to say, of course, Esther, you should go talk to the king. In fact, that's what Mordecai tells her to do. Mordecai sends a message to Esther saying, you've got to go talk to the king. Like, you're the only hope. You've got to say something. And again, we would think, well, of course you should. Why wouldn't you? Well, like, why is this even a thought? The lives of your people are on the line. Esther, you've got to go talk to the king. Well, there's several reasons actually that make this decision pretty complicated. Reason number one, it's a fairly familiar reason. If Esther goes before the king without being summoned, her own life is on the line. So we read this in chapter 4, verse 11. Any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that he be put to death. The only exception to this is for the king to raise his golden scepter. In fact, there's this ancient historian named Herodias, and he confirms this fact, and he actually says there's only 7 men who are on a short list, and they can go before the king without being killed. But Esther's not on that list. And so if she goes before the king without being summoned, there really is a possibility that this king, Xerxes, would execute her. Just look at his track record. He's already disposed of Queen Vashti, and then when Haman has come to him with this request, he has agreed to commit genocide. It's like, this is not a rational person. This is not a calm, kind, gracious, reasonable man. This is a neurotic, irrational, crazy man. I mean, would you want to go before this kind of a king to make any kind of a request? So that's one reason that makes Esther's decision pretty complicated. A second reason has to do with her marriage. 5 years pass between chapter 1 and chapter 2 of the book of Esther, meaning that Esther is like old news. Like, I appreciate what Dave said earlier about being married for 2 years, and that's an interesting point in your marriage. When you get to year 5 in marriage, like, this is the point where the oxytocin has faded, the honeymoon is over, the puppy dog love is gone. And this is the point in your marriage where you wake up in the morning and you roll over and you think to yourself, It's still you. Now, I celebrated my 18th anniversary just a few weeks ago with Mary. I don't feel that way. I still think that Mary is the most beautiful woman in the world. But I'm just saying that for most people, you get to year 5 and it's like, yeah, it's old news. This is where Esther's at in her relationship with King Xerxes. And so she doesn't have that in her advantage anymore to go before the king. So that's another reason that this gets a little complicated. Maybe she doesn't want to go before the king. And the third reason that this decision is a difficult one for her to make, and this is going to be a little strange for some of you to hear because maybe you don't think this about Esther, but Esther is not necessarily an upstanding Jew. And here's what I mean by this. So when Haman goes to the king earlier in the book to make this speech about why King Xerxes should eliminate the Jews, he has this line in his speech. Haman says, "There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all the other people." So how does Haman know who is a Jew and who's not a Jew in the kingdom? It has nothing to do with skin pigmentation. Everybody in this world, generally speaking, would have looked similar when it comes to skin pigmentation. There'd be a lot of brown and tan tones. So you don't just know who the Jews are based on looking at them. The only way you know who the Jews are is by their way of life. They wouldn't work on Saturdays. They would restrict themselves from eating certain kinds of foods. They wouldn't go to the pagan temples to worship the pagan gods. They regularly would be seen praying to their God. That's how you know who the Jews are. Nobody in the palace knows that Esther is a Jew. So what does that mean about Esther? Well, it means she's not necessarily the most devout, faithful Jew. If Esther were following Torah, everybody would know who she was. She wouldn't be worshiping at the pagan temple. She would be practicing Sabbath day. She would be praying on a regular basis. And yet Haman doesn't know these things. Haman doesn't believe that she's a Jew. In fact, if she's following Torah, she's never going to marry King Xerxes. In other words, Esther didn't become queen to save her people. Esther became queen to save herself. And so Mordecai sends word to her, hey, you've got to go talk to the king. Esther didn't sign up for that. She didn't ascend royalty to protect her people. She did this for herself. And so she's not so sure that she wants to lay her own life on the line for this people that she never really wanted to save in the first place. So again, it's a complicated book. This is a complicated decision. There is a truth in the middle of the story that I would like to highlight. This truth provides a lot of encouragement to you, to me, as we live our lives in this complicated world. And I think you can hold on to this truth, even in the middle of whatever mess you find yourself in right now. The truth comes in the middle of this speech that Mordecai gives Esther. It's actually the most famous line in this speech. So here's the most famous line, and then there's a preceding line that's also very important. The most famous line in the whole book is this. Mordecai is trying to motivate Esther, and he says, "Who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" It's a line about courage. And in fact, next week, we're going to drill more into what does that mean to be courageous. Today, what I'd like to do is reflect upon the line just before that famous sentence. Here's the preceding line. Verse 14. "If you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place." In other words, Esther, if you fail miserably, Like if you get scared and you run back to your bedroom and you bury your head in your pillow and you cry because you can't handle the pressure of going before the king, like if you totally fail, guess what? God's people are going to be fine. And they're not going to die. Because God is going to save them. So here's the truth that I'd like to give to you today from this one line in this speech. It's a really simple thought. You've had this thought before, but I'd like you to really lean into this thought and try to apply it to your life. Here's the thought. It's very simple. God is not worried. In fact, I would say God is never worried. God is the most non-anxious presence in the universe. Now, God does experience emotion in the Bible. Sometimes God grieves, like we see Jesus grieving at Lazarus' tomb. In the flood narrative, God regrets that he's made mankind. That's the Hebrew word there. So there's grief there. He doesn't give up. He's faithful, but he's sad in that story. There's other times in the Bible where God gets angry. Plenty of times God shows his wrath. But even in those times, his wrath is coming out of a place of love. In fact, quick side story here. A few months ago, it's in the middle of winter. Remember that 48-hour period where there's just ice all over the roads? Well, I'm driving to work one day, and I'm coming down a hill, and I'm not going fast, but it's ice. And a child on his little trike crosses right in front of me, and I just scream. I'm mad. I yell at this kid because I'm going down this hill, and even though I'm slamming on my brakes, it's ice, and my car's not stopping, and I'm furious. And so out loud, I'm in my car by myself just yelling at this kid and the kid's parents, and why would you let this kid happen? And I narrowly miss the kid. He goes right in front of my car, and I miss him. So I'm angry. The wrath of Phil emerged in the car by myself. But did that wrath and that anger come from a place of hate? Did I hate the kid? No, I love the kid. And so my wrath was a subset of my love. So in the Old Testament, especially when we read texts about the anger of God, the wrath of God, it's never in opposition to the love of God. It's always a derivative of the love of God. So God experiences all these emotions all throughout the Bible. But the main point I'm making right now is that anxiety is not one of them. God is the least anxious presence in the universe. Think for a moment about what God has seen throughout the course of human history. God was there early on in the Crusades, this dark mark of Christian history when Christians carried their swords around and they would ask people if they believed in Jesus, and if they said no, these Christians would just kill people. Well, God was there. He walked through that difficult time with Christians. God has been there through all the death and the plagues and the horrible things that have happened in the history of humankind. He's been there in all the wars that we have had as human beings. He's been there through the cultivation of civilization and the rise of various forms of government throughout the world. He has witnessed the development of Eastern culture and Western culture. God's been there through it all. And then you think about what God knows about the future. He knows where it's all going. Like he holds the future in his hands, and so therefore he's not anxious. Like there's nothing that's a threat to God. Satan is not a threat to God. Death is not a threat to God. The ambiguity of culture today is not a threat to God. He has seen it all. And so don't you think that kind of a God could come alongside you with whatever you're facing today and give you a little bit of that calm and that peace? There's nothing in God's world that can upset the balance of God's heart. He's non-anxious. And I know that you know that. But what I hope happens today is that truth can actually sink into the heart. In fact, being non-anxious is a form of ministry. Like, we can experience this with each other. So, for example, when an infant cries, a parent will go hold the infant. And what happens over time, sometimes this takes a long time, depending on the infant, but over time, the calmness of the parent's heart starts to change the child. The parent doesn't even have to say much, but there's a power that a non-anxious presence can have on somebody else. Or another scenario, imagine a room of rambunctious third graders. And they're throwing things around the classroom, and they're calling each other's names, and they're just really rowdy. And then, let's say, this really kind, gracious, calm administrator walks into the classroom, and he sits right in the middle of this group of third graders. What's going to happen? The presence of this man or woman is going to affect the group. He or she doesn't even have to say anything. There's a power in presence. Or consider a group of grieving people. They've just lost someone that they love, and they're reeling, and the death is so visceral, and everybody's crying, and no one knows what to do. And then someone walks into the room, and it's that family member that carries themselves with a lot of serenity. Or it's the elder or the minister that's been a long-time friend of the family, and they walk into the room, and what happens? There's a peace that settles on the grieving people. And again, the person walking into the room doesn't even have to say anything. There's a ministry that can happen through presence. I watched this happen 2 years ago, and we're in the middle of COVID, and Heidi has a birthday party, I think the next day, and she is not feeling good. And so Mary and I are thinking, oh no, what if this is COVID and we don't have a test? And so we call Amanda Watson. Amanda Watson has an at-home test, and we say, hey, is there any way you can come over and give Heidi a test? She says, sure. So she comes to our doorstep. It's like 10 o'clock at night. She gives Heidi the test, and immediately, within like a minute, 2 red lines come on the little indicator. Heidi tested positive. And we all just stood on the front porch just kind of looking at each other. Mary and I knew that Heidi was going to be so upset because we're going to cancel the birthday party. And we didn't really know what to tell her, and nobody knew what to say. And Amanda saved the day. She pulled Heidi into a hug. And she said, Heidi, I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid of you. It's okay that you have COVID. You're going to be okay. Everything's going to be fine. And we all calmed down because of what Amanda did. And so here's the point. If human beings can have that effect on each other, what effect do you think that God, this kind of a God, could have on your life? See, many of you got up this morning and your life's very complicated. Your health's not where you want it to be. That one relationship with that one person is really, really rocky, or you're really upset because somebody said something and you're not sure how to interpret it, and now there's this rupture in the relationship and you don't know what to do about it. And that one bill came in the mail last week and you don't really have the money to pay it, and so now you're just sitting here and you're singing these songs, but you feel the weight. Like, all of us feel something today. And when you get back in your car in a few minutes after class to go home, that burden's still going to be there, but here's the reality of what could happen. You could be different because of church today. Like, some of us, we come to church and we are so used to going through the motions that we forget that every Sunday, when we walk into this room and we sing these songs, this is a chance to have an encounter with the creator of the universe. And the way you have that encounter is you have an openness of heart. See, if you come into worship with a closed heart, you're not going to leave changed. But if you come into worship with an openness about you and a desire to encounter this God, this Lord and Savior Jesus, then it's possible to walk away from this place a little less anxious. And so that's my invitation to you this morning, is to take a deep breath, to recognize the presence of the Lord in the room. This God who's not stressed out in the book of Esther when all these Jews are about to die is the same God that's here in the room with you today. And if you open up your heart to him, he can change you from the inside out. And so we're going to sing this song, simple song, Hide Me Away, O Lord. And while we sing it, my hope and my prayer for you is that you can lean into the presence of God and let his non-anxious presence affect your heart. If there's anything that you need in a public way while we sing, whether that be prayer or baptism, you're welcome to come tell me about that. Let's stand and let's sing.